Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Kingsley, for both of your presentations. It's given us a lot to think about. Hopefully I'll be able to tie in a little bit with what both of you spoke about. But first, my presentation will be a little bit more informal, a little bit shorter. So I'm going to speak a bit about the work that we do at the Land Council in the heritage management space, and then I'll bring it back to this conversation that we're having about sites. So just bear with me for the first part here. So I'm the Heritage Advisor at the Northern Land Council. I previously started working at the Land Council in 2022 as an anthropologist in native title, but previously I was working as an archaeologist in New South Wales. And so when I started, it was a new space for me to be working in, and I was really excited to see how I could bring that heritage management experience into this role. And how we sort of started to do that was in a very informal way, and it was in things like our policy submissions and for water extraction and land clearing. It was in the way that we started doing consultation. We would begin asking people about archaeological sites that they were aware of on their country, if they knew of any, if they wanted more protections in place for those. They were aware of the existing legislation to protect archaeological sites in the territory. And then it became more and more formalised in our Future Act space when we were taking witness statements for objections to the expedited procedure. And so it was in that space that we were able to have consultations with native title holders, and then in our putting forth our evidence, remind proponents of their obligations under obviously the Native Title Act, but also of the Heritage Act. And so what I'll speak a bit today is how we're developing that practice at the Land Council, and where we're hoping to go with it a bit more in the future. And so how we're doing that firstly is through the existing legislative framework in the Northern Territory, and then also through agreement making space. So we work closely with the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority at the Land Council, because we have two core pieces of legislation that we work under, the Native Title Act and the Aboriginal Land Rights Act. And then we also work very closely with the Sacred Sites Act. But there is another piece of legislation that exists in the Territory called the Heritage Act, and that's administered by the NT Heritage Branch. And it's under this piece of legislation that there is protection for Aboriginal and Macassan places and objects. That's how it is defined in the Act. And this is a piece of legislation that it has its limitations, but it's underutilised in the Territory. In the Territory, there's a greater focus on, I guess it would fall under the intangible aspect of cultural heritage, and so through the Sacred Sites Act and that very strong existing practice in the Territory. But there is this piece of legislation, this Heritage Act, where it actually has some strength behind it. Archaeological places and objects are automatically protected under this piece of legislation, and that's whether they are known or unknown. And that's quite strong. The difficulties that they have with this piece of legislation is compliance and resourcing. And so, I spoke a bit already about the legislative framework that we are working in, and then implementing some of these heritage management principles in our policy submissions and our agreement making, and trying to put them in our exploration agreements, but then also in our larger mining agreements as well, so in our ILUAs and things like that. But what we can do is we remind people that this piece of legislation exists, because a lot of traditional owners in the Territory, they're very familiar with the Sacred Sites Act, because people have been consulted on it for a number of years, but less familiar with the Heritage Act, and that they can protect their archaeological sites as well. And that has a lot of power in it, because people are out on country and they're monitoring land use activities, they're monitoring land clearing and digging into country, and it's in this space where they actually have a bit of power to stop work activities on country if they're aware of this piece of legislation. So the limitations of the Heritage Act, this obviously isn't a piece of legislation that the NLC administers, but it's something that is very useful to remind proponents of, because under this piece of legislation, the limitations include the lack of requirement for consultation, Obviously at the Land Council, consultation is bread and butter of our practice. But at the Heritage Branch, they are a small team. Their legislation does not require consultation, and so that means that reports could, in theory, be written without any consultation with traditional owners, which is not best practice. That's not what we want to see in the Territory, or anywhere really. Let's be honest. But yeah, so the limitations include the consultation and the compliance of the Act, and so because there is a rather unique legislative framework that exists in the Territory. We have the Sacred Sites Act, and proponents are familiar with this piece of legislation, and often their obligations under it. But then there's also what runs parallel to that is the Heritage Act, and proponents are less familiar with this piece of legislation and how they interact. And there's risk of following one pathway and then forgetting about the other. When we look at tangible and intangible cultural heritage, these things they're intrinsically linked, and I think that's something that can be said from both of these presentations. Both the anthropological record and the archaeological record can serve to complement each other and really strengthen our understanding of what is going on in country and in these cultural landscapes. So, what was I talking about next? In the agreement making space, so there's this legislative framework that we can work within. It has its limitations, but where we have more strength is in agreement making. And so we can try and work with proponents to negotiate agreements for exploration. There's less appetite for proponents to enter in agreements for exploration. But for larger scale projects like that require an ILUA, there's a bit more negotiating power for native title holders in that space. And there's been a lot of discussion about ILUAs today, so I hope that's something we can talk a bit more about in the discussion portion of this, because there are lots of issues with it, but there is potential in that space to negotiate greater heritage management provisions than what would have been there otherwise. And so that has a bit more negotiating power in it in the work that we're currently doing. So why is this something that's necessary to put more heritage principles within agreement making and working it within this legislative pathways that we currently have in existence? It's because there are these gaps, as we've talked about a bit with the use of language and sites and places, and under the Heritage Act it defines archaeological places and objects. Under the Sacred Sites Act we obviously look at sacred sites, but there are these gaps between that doesn't capture the broader cultural landscape that people want to protect. So like cultural roots and cultural landscapes. There are various soft law instruments that can be used in this space, like the Bara Charter, Darawanilan, that can be used to underpin the negotiation of certain heritage management provisions within ILUAs. And this is very necessary to fill those gaps. So it's in this space that the Land Council, when we're negotiating on behalf of native title holders, we can have a bit more of an impact because we can set minimum standards for what should be included in heritage management. This is something that isn't present within the legislation. There are no guidelines attached to what is required, particularly for cultural heritage management plans that may be required in order to get an environmental impact statement. So in the Territory, we have the Northern Territory Environment Protection Act. And under that, if a large-scale project is going ahead, a proponent is required to go and get an EIS, and within that they're required to do an environmental studies, but also a cultural values assessment. The cultural values assessment usually comes in the form of a cultural heritage management plan. Now, for these cultural heritage management plans, there aren't any guidelines in the Territory for what should be included in them, not like there are in other states, like in New South Wales and Queensland and Victoria. And so it just means that a document could be produced that isn't necessarily fit for purpose. It hasn't had consultation, it might not have best practice standards in it. And so in the agreement making space, we can set minimum standards for what should be included in cultural heritage management plans. And other heritage assessments that are occurring on country, and also set consultation requirements that we want to see. The difficulty in here is the language, and that's something that's been touched on a bit already today. Obviously in Australia, the accepted language in heritage, so we have the Heritage Act, and that captures a whole number of cultural values within it. And then in the Territory, we have the Sacred Sites Act, which is separating those two concepts of intangible and tangible. And so all these legislations, various heritage regimes in Australia, they have their own limitations. But what we're trying to do, I guess, is to fill the gaps of where those limitations are particularly difficult to navigate for traditional owners to protect their cultural heritage. And so the better way to do that is we do that through consultation when we're negotiating agreements on behalf of native title holders. And we just have to find a better way to represent the interests of traditional owners in that space. But yes, a difficulty in that is resourcing. And also compliance of the agreement. So we're talking about before about the agreement can exist, but it's the compliance of the agreement and the implementation of the agreement that is the difficulty a lot of the time, because there might be a fantastic agreement that's in place, but there's been no compliance kept to it for like several years. And so therefore, especially in the Territory, and I guess it's lots of places in Australia where you're working in really remote areas, if it's a proponent that's not particularly familiar with their obligations under the various legislation, there's a huge risk to cultural values being impacted. And so compliance is a really big issue in this space. But the positives that we're trying to work through is finding where the archaeological record can complement the anthropological record. So in the Territory, the Heritage Branch has a database of archaeological sites from, I guess, when archaeology began in the Territory, and it's mostly through academia, because there is a bit of a difficulty in getting proponents to provide the reports that they are producing for various land use activities or work programs or projects and things like that. They often will get some, but it isn't always the case. But there is still an archaeological record present, and that could serve to assist with completing aspects of the anthropological record. So there's ways in which they can work together. Yes, another positive is like including minimum standards in agreements and just having very clear expectations set for proponents in the work that they're doing. Often I've seen cultural heritage management plans that just they wouldn't meet the requirements of other states and territories and under their legislation. And so wanting to bring that up in the Territory as well is really important. And if we can't do that through the current legislation, then we can try and do that in agreements. It's also a great opportunity for employment for native title holders. We recently had an agreement where kind of were brought in part-way through it, and there had already been heritage surveys conducted. However, there were some big gaps in those heritage surveys, and in our role representing the native title holders, we were able to get further monitoring on country and able to get native title holders out on country so that they could be employed by that proponent and monitor any kind of land clearing activities that were happening over a 6-week period that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And so it allows a bit more oversight over what is being done here in the archaeological space. Yes, but I think that's kind of mostly what I was here to talk about, but I hope we can have a bit more of a discussion about sites and places and that kind of thing.